My name is Paul Wolliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products. I get quite a few phone calls from customers wanting to know how to make their inverter generator even quieter. And this is not a simple solution because there's a lot more going on than most people realize. So let's go ahead and try to explain this without dragging people into the deep end of the pool and drowning them. To start off with, there are three methods, or three common methods, of reducing sound. And the first one would be blocking or attenuation. And straightforward and simple, we'll say you got a generator right here, and you're standing here, and you put a wall between you. That would be blocking or attenuation, or putting earplugs in your ears. Pretty simple. And that's the first method of reducing noise. The next method of reducing noise would be absorption or damping. So there's a couple of methods for absorption or damping. One of them is, instead of just a simple wall, you put a mattress between you, and the mass of the mattress will help absorb it. Or, to a certain degree, rubber motor mounts for the engine itself. And if your generator is on rubber mounts inside the case, that will help with that. And then the last method is the decoupling. And let me go into it just a little bit here. I guess the easiest illustration would, and this would be looking from the top down, if you looked at a wall in a house and you've got a stud wall. So you'd be looking at, here's your studs, and they're 16 inches apart. Of course, this is not drawn to scale because those would be 2x4 studs. And then you'd have a piece of drywall on both sides. And we'll say your generator was still here, and you were still here. And you put this wall, and that would block. However, it would be even more effective at decoupling the noise if your wall were a soundproof wall. And the simplest way to illustrate this would be to say that your stud walls, you would have a row of 2x4s offset a little bit. And again, every two of them is 16 inches apart in this way, and this is not drawn to scale. But then this layer of drywall is screwed or bolted to this stud wall, and this drywall is screwed or bolted to this, and we'll go ahead and put another stud in here, to this one. And these two are not connected here, so this wall can vibrate or resonate independently of this one, and that way you get a blocking effect as well as a decoupling effect. So those are the three primary means. And then Honda did something and upped the ante back when they first came out with the inverter-based generators. If you've got a Honda 3000 or Honda 6500, you may or may not have noticed that when you take the door, and there are hinged doors on the Honda and a metal cabinet, but if you take the door and you move it almost closed when the generator is running, it'll suck the door shut. And here's a little bit about that. We'll say that you've got the engine. This would be the cylinder head, and then the cylinder fins and the crankcase. And I'm not going to show the generator and so on it. But then, right around the engine, there's a cabinet, fairly tight. And then there is the intake fan on one side, and then the output, which goes around the exhaust pipe. So it ducts all the hot air, and we'll say that the muffler is here, and there's an opening right here, so it ducts the hot air out of here around the muffler. So this cabinet is open here. And then you've got the cabinet that you see, and that's the one with the big old Honda logo and so forth. And then up here at the top is where it outputs the hot air. And in here, and right here, are some slots cut to pull in air. This intake with the fan blowing into here is actually larger than this one here. So what it does is it creates a high pressure air zone around the engine, and the high pressure air around the engine is better at reducing the thermal heat load. And then there's a low pressure area here, because these intakes are slightly restricted, and the intake and the exhaust are separated from each other. And if you've got a Honda 3000 or any of the early Hondas, you notice that there is a specific wall in there, so that you've got the hot side and the cold side, or intake and exhaust side, so that as it blows this air out of here, it doesn't come back around and loop in. So this low pressure air zone, which is the majority of the cabinet, if you remember back in school, sound waves don't travel as fast through low pressure, which is why speed of sound at standard temperature and pressures, I think it was 741 miles an hour, whatever, it doesn't matter the specifics, but as you go up in altitude or lower barometric pressure, the speed of sound decreases. So sound waves don't travel as well through low pressure. And that's how Honda has improved on the situation quite a bit. Most of the Chinese generators rely heavily on sound absorption, or like the mattress between you. Their cabinet would be, and then the engine inside. And because their cabinets are usually plastic instead of metal, they can't rely on different pressures, because the cabinet is going to leak so much anyway. So they line it with the high density foam all the way around it. And if you looked at the high density foam that they use, it's not super simple. We'll say that here's your layer of foam, and this is a cross section of it, and this will be your heat load, or your noise, right here. The first layer will be some kind of a strong layer of either thin metal or thin plastic or something like this. And then it will be a very low density foam right here, and then a slightly heavier density foam. And often the low density foam is not flat. It's like an egg crate. Indentations and peaks and valleys into it. And then the next layer is going to be a solid foam of a little bit higher density. And in the next layer will usually be a rubber or something. And then finally, the bonding layer will be either a thin layer of aluminum or a thin layer of plastic with an adhesive right here that they can then use to glue it to the cabinet. And that's pretty common among the Chinese generators. So, if you had a generator, and we won't get into the specific details here, but we'll just say here is your generator. And here is your output of the hot air and then here's the intake, usually low from the bottom or from the front, and it's usually blown out high in the back. Say this is your generator and you wanted to make it even quieter yet. Most people will then put it in a box. Okay, so when you put it in this box, it's going to attenuate or block just because of the walls of the box. If you line it with a foam, especially noise deadening foam, it will get even quieter yet. The problem is that when you do this, you need to let the hot air get out. So in order to create a labyrinth effect, we'll say we're going to move our output to here. So the air is going to come out of the generator up high, and it's going to come down here and go through a slight labyrinth effect. And then we're going to say that the intake we're going to make here. However, the fan that's built into the generator that pulls the air through it is designed to work very well with this cabinet. And because you've got insulation around here, you're not going to get good convection of air. So it's going to get a little bit hotter. One thing I strongly suggest to people is, and we'll pause here for a minute, if you go into the grilling section of some stores, you'll find these meat thermometers that they've got a transmitter with a little probe that you stick into the meat, and then they've got a receiver that is about the size of a smartphone, and you put that in your shirt pocket, and you can look at it and see what the temperature of your meat is on the grill. And that works real well if you drill a small hole in the oil fill cap and push the probe through that oil fill cap hole to where it's immersed in the oil. You don't want it touching the housing of the engine. You want the oil temperature, because that'll change more quickly than the engine block temperature, and it'll give you a really good idea of what your engine temperatures are. So you would start the generator in your driveway and run it for several hours under different conditions to get an idea of what the average oil temperature is and what the normal engine temperatures are while it's running. So now, when you put it in your case, then you can watch the oil temperatures and you go, okay, it's getting too hot or it's getting just right, and so on. What I have seen happen here is that, number one, thing's running out of ink. You've got an area here where you've got exhaust mixing with the intake, and that's not a good thing, because the exhaust doesn't have oxygen in that air because it's already been burned up. So you need to put a baffle so that your clean oxygenated air does not mix with the exhaust air where the oxygen has been used up and it's full of hydrocarbons. So now, if your oil temperature is still getting hot, you look at it and you say, okay, we need to increase the airflow, which means either putting a fan here blowing air in, or putting a fan here blowing air out. And think about that for a minute. Most of these generators are carbureted, not fuel injected. So if you've got a carbureted engine, you're probably familiar with the fact that as you go up in altitude, the air is less dense, and therefore the engines will run rich. And most of the manufacturers make a high altitude jetting kit. We'll say that they've got one for sea level, one for 2,500 feet, one for 5,000 feet, one for 7,500, and so on. So as the air pressure goes up, the engine leans out, or as the air pressure goes down, the engine gets richer. Because of that, we'll say your engine is running just a little bit warm, and you decide to put a fan here. If this fan is blowing too much air into this area here, then it's also going to flow in here more easily and raise the air pressure around the carburetor and the flow bowl vent, which will then make the engine run leaner. And if an engine runs leaner, it gets hot. So I don't actually favor blowing air into the cabinet. I would put the fans on the output side where they suck air out of the cabinet, because then you are aiding the airflow, but you're not putting a large or a pressurized air on the intake side, which will disturb the mixture. So if you build yourself a cabinet something like this and use some of the Doral electric fans and so forth like that, you can pull the air out. Just monitor everything to make sure that you're not eliminating one problem and creating another one. Obviously, if you did put air in here and it increased the amount of air density, which would then lean out the motor, by putting that fan in there, it's actually going to get hotter, because the motor's going to run leaner, and a lean motor runs hotter than a rich motor. Just be very careful of that and monitor what you're doing and all the cause and effect. At any rate, that's a real quick rundown of why the enclosed inverter-based generators are so quiet. If you have any more questions about this, you can either contact me through my website. If you look in the description section of this video below, you'll see that there is contact information for how to get in touch with me through my website. Other than that, I thank you so much.